Hello, everyone. Welcome to Clarity 15.9.2 Supportability Training. In this section, we will review several roadmap enhancements, including an update to the roadmap list view, the configurable roadmap item grid, and the application of common components utilized throughout Clarity, impacting the roadmap, timeline, board, and grid views. So let's get started. What's new? So we're going to look at three improvements here. First, the roadmap grid includes an add button specifically to support creating new roadmaps that have required fields. Second, the roadmap item grid has been refactored to incorporate the common grid toolset used throughout Clarity, which enables group by and export to CSV, to name a few. And third, the roadmap timeline, board, and grid views have all been updated with common components used throughout Clarity as well. So there's the filtering, configurable filtering. Of course, there's search, but also there's a configurable details flyout that's available from each one of these views. As part of the third item, roadmap board cards are now configurable to be consistent with other boards that are used throughout Clarity. Why is this important? The new roadmap creation sequence aims to ensure users supply required fields when creating new roadmaps. Most importantly, this capability was a top innovation request originally planned for the next release, the Q3 release, but we're delivering it early, so we're really excited about that. Regarding the roadmap item grid, delivering the configurable roadmap item grid is important to drive adoption. Users have become really accustomed to the flexible tools to manage company-specific roadmaps. The configure grid helps users quickly manage large amounts of roadmap data and prepare the right information at the right time. The improvements to the roadmap timeline, board, and grid views also drives adoption. Users expect these same tools in roadmaps, such as the filtering, the detail flyout, the search, configurable board cards that are available throughout other parts of Clarity. So what's changed? There's a lot to talk about, so let's get started. First, the roadmap grid includes an add button specifically to support creating roadmaps when there are required fields in play. So as I mentioned, this new roadmap creation sequence aims to ensure users supply the required fields when they're creating those roadmaps. Duration is a required field, but will default to 1 year. ID is a required field as well, but it's typically set to auto number, so users don't have to complete those required fields. But as the add button is clicked, a new row is inserted into the grid, and then the required fields are populated in the grid. You can see here there's an extension here in the middle called product group. That's a custom attribute for the roadmap. It's set as required. You want to have data integrity, and so this new creation sequence ensures that. With 15.9.2, the roadmap item grid has been refactored and now incorporates the full complement of common grid tool sets utilized throughout Clarity, including column configuration, the detail flyout, save views, robust filtering, search, group by, export to CSV. In 15.9.1, the roadmap item grid had a limited set of configuration capabilities, the column configuration, save views, and search. But in this release, it's got the full complement of that tool set. In 15.9.2, the roadmap timeline, grid, and board views have been updated to include three common tools that are pervasive throughout Clarity. That filtering component that's at the top of the page, search, of course, and more importantly, in this scenario, the configurables details flyout on the right-hand side. So this is an example of the timeline. Normally, you would have that pop-up that had limited configuration capability. That's been eliminated and replaced with the flyout. with a little more detail here on the configurable filtering and search. So as I mentioned, the roadmap filtering is now there. You got that powerful filtering with support for custom and stock attributes, and or, which is essentially the match all and match any feature that was introduced in the previous release as a common grid element. And of course, in search with the name and ID. The lower left of the screen just highlights the 15.9.1 filtering that was in place across roadmaps, whether it was a board or a grid or a timeline. Of course, it was limited to a fixed set of criterion, and now with the change here, it's far more robust and consistent with the rest of the application. I touched on this, but it's worth mentioning again that the roadmap item configuration accessed from the timeline, board, or grid views is now done through that configurable flyout, which is positioned there in the center of the screen. So as those of you familiar with the application, this is now consistent with other parts of the app. In 15.9.1, the image in the upper right shows you the limited static pop-up that was available to add data to a roadmap. This is non-configurable pop-up. It has been eliminated. So it's been replaced, like I said, with the configurable flyout. That's right there in the middle of the page. Roadmap board cards are now configurable, which again, it's consistent with other boards used throughout Clarity. In 15.9.1, roadmap board cards configuration was really restricted or limited to naming the columns and choosing the color by scheme. In this release, 15.9.2, roadmap board card configuration is endless, right? The configuration configurable card options include the title, the fields. You got 4 attributes you can put there. Metrics, you can put 3 attributes there, and then of course the start and end period. Customer stock attributes or the fields can be used in the board card title, field, and metrics as well. The behavior of the start and end period is now consistent with other parts of Clarity. For example, roadmap duration. From a roadmap duration perspective, you're no longer constrained to the roadmap start and end dates. Clipping. In 15.9.2, the clip metrics to roadmap dates, that capability has been removed. As a refresher, when that was selected, clipping calculated totals within the boundaries of the roadmap start and end dates. When it wasn't used, totals were calculated using the outside boundaries of roadmap item start and end dates, essentially ignoring the roadmap start and end dates, and that was kind of the desired effect. So in 15.9.2, in the middle here, users have more control and flexibility over how totals are calculated using the new sum of periods or grand totals capabilities, which at the end of the day remove the need for clip metrics capability. So this isn't something that we're holding off on and going to bring it back. It's really being supplemented by the new capabilities there in terms of the filtering and working with start period and end period. All right, let me find my mouse. Roadmap scenario comparisons is not available in 15.9.2. Roadmap scenario comparisons will be reintroduced in the next release, which is the Q3 release. It's a top priority for that next release. In the near term, roadmap scenarios can be exported to CSV, right? We've got the new export to CSV capability on the grid, so it can be exported for comparison outside of Clarity. Now, the product team looked at this and realized that there's quite a number of customers that are using this capability. However, the team determined there was more value in delivering the new roadmap capabilities that we're covering now, minus scenario comparisons, and doing that now versus no new roadmap capabilities for another 3 months. So in addition, the roadmap timeline tool set, where comparisons is represented, it will be updated in this next release cycle. So there's just like the task timeline has been updated, the roadmap timeline will be updated to this new capability, which will enable us or set us up for more advanced user configuration capabilities, and those, such as putting milestones or things like that on the timeline. And these more advanced configuration capabilities are planned for the end of the year release. So in the end, roadmap scenario comparisons capability will be reintroduced in the next release using the new roadmap timeline toolset. The roadmap details page. So in 15.9.1, roadmaps are configured in, we'll call it a details page, which you would access through that upper right button wherever you were on a given roadmap. And it had a limited set of attributes such as roadmap name, author, OBS for security, right, start and duration to kind of set the parameters for the roadmap. So this non-configurable page has been eliminated. So in 15.9.2, roadmaps are configured directly from the roadmap grid itself or from its configurable flyout. Essentially, this is no different than what was in place last release. There was just this extra panel here. So there's really no change in functionality compared to 15.9.1 other than this page being eliminated. In the end, this change should not impact users because the roadmap grid and its configurable details flyout have been available for a few releases now. Okay, in plan, this change should not impact users because the 15.9.1 capabilities that are on the right side of the screen here are available in 15.9.2. That's just the user experience is really the change. So on the right-hand side, you see a way of when you're on the grid for marking, if there's an action menu, right, there's an ellipse, you open that up and you mark things, you mark all things on the page in plan, or you remove all things from in plan on that, that pop-up there. So in 15.9.2 on the left-hand side, that in plan option is actually a pull down. So you've got that capability right there. And of course, now that we have the configurable roadmap item grid, copy paste, bulk edit, all those capabilities essentially removes the need for that action menu that was in 15. Or is in 15.9.1. They're on the right hand side. So like I said, that change shouldn't be a big impact. It's just something you should be aware of. What's changed? All right, calculated attributes. These can now be used as roadmap targets. In 15.9.1, the roadmap calculated attributes could be used in a grid. You could insert them in the grid and use them, but you couldn't have it as a target. In addition, the calculated attributes can be configured as a roadmap item metric for display in the timeline view or board cards. And since targets align with in plan, roadmap item targets also respect grand totals or sum of totals and the use of the fiscal period carousel. And also that global date and unit of measure like FTE hours, days, the use is set in settings and general. Roadmaps now responds to those settings as well. Okay, so that kind of gets us through what's new in slideware. Let's take a look at this in action. We'll talk about creating a new roadmap with required fields, understand the configurable roadmap item grid. We'll look at that flyout and the search tools, and we'll configure a board card. So I'm going to switch gears here and go to the application. Okay, Viv, if you can just confirm you can see my screen and we'll get going.
Yes, I can.
All right, perfect, thank you. All right, in this section, we're going to review the 3 new capabilities, starting with the ability to create a roadmap that has required fields. I'm going to open the navigation panel here and just highlight, right, there's a new set of icons that are here, and there's a new icon for roadmaps. I'm going to go ahead and click into that. And I want to draw your attention to the 4 required fields that are here: name, category, author, and start. Those are at least on the page. As I mentioned earlier, roadmap ID is typically, at least in this system, roadmap ID is set to auto numbering and duration defaults to 1 year. So users don't have to worry about keying in those required fields when creating a new roadmap. I also want to draw your attention to the plus button that is here. That is sort of the add button. It will coexist on the page with the new roadmap button. Ultimately, we see these two coming together and taking on a similar behavior of the create template, create new project from template, where there's basically a blueprint capability for road mapping, and we're looking for that in an upcoming release. So the functionality behind the new roadmap button has not changed. I'll go ahead and click that. And these are the standard 3 fields, the static fields that pop up. I'm going to go ahead and hit create. I'm not going to change the name. And it's going to tell me, hey, there's a required field. So the user then simply comes into the add button and keys in the appropriate information. I'll just do roadmap, and I'll get over to the required field there. I'll put in the author is going to be Cheryl, and our start period is going to be 2021. And then, like I said, duration auto populates that, and ID does, and those are over here, right? There's where's my duration? I don't see it. I do have ID though. So that's the basically the extent of the demo for creating a new roadmap from with required fields. It's fairly straightforward. So let's move on to the demonstration of configurable roadmap item grid. We'll go into the retail banking strategy roadmap, and I'll select the grid view. Let me close that window there. Close that again. It's bugging me, not you guys. And I will select the cost versus benefit view. Okay, so here we are. We're now in the this configurable grid, and many of you are familiar with the capabilities that are afforded through that tool set. But I'll just go through a couple things here. I'll just highlight this credit card payments row, and we have now a details flyout. This wasn't available from the grid view in prior releases. I'm going to go ahead and configure. I've got something called planning notes. I'll draw that in, and let's see, it's sized appropriately. I'll close that out. And you can see, I didn't mean to close that out all the way. You can see I brought in a rich text field here. Large string rich text attributes can now sync 2 roadmap items from their linked investments. So that's a new piece as well. So I'll go ahead and close the flyout here. The next thing I want to do is talk about the filters. I've got my filter button here. I'm going to go in and search for in plan, and I'll set that to in plan and come back out. I'll group by sponsor, right? All these powerful tools that the grid brings us. And I'll expand, Beth, you can see that she's responsible for in-plan things, roughly 689, right? So I'd like to export this to CSV. I want to look at it. That's that new capability here. Oh, this has been, is grayed out when you're using group by. This is no change from the last release. This is expected behavior for the time being. And so I just wanted to point that out to you in case someone tried to do that in group by mode. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the group by. I want to draw your attention to the 13 items that are here down in the lower left. And I'll just go ahead and hit export to CSV. I'm on a Mac, so I get a file down there in my tray. I'll bring it up. I'll make this a little bit larger. And this lovely button's in the way. But as you can see, all the groupings that are there from the grid, all the column headers and grouping, it's all here and it looks fantastic. So this is great news. I can get that out and do some further manipulation. So I'll go ahead and close that Excel file. As you can see, I'll open, this is a 2-year roadmap. It's grouped in quarters. So I should have, I'm going out to 2022 here, Q4, and the costing runs out because there's nothing happening out there in that second part of the year. And my carousel shows 8 periods, but I want to review it from a monthly perspective. So I just come into the carousel or the view options window and I will select months, and that 8 periods is now changing to 24 months, as you'd expect, right? I also want to look at this for 6 months at a time. So I'm going to leave my start here, and I'm going to come in and pick June, and now I've got my 6 periods. You notice I've got grand total being used. That means show me the totals for the entire duration of this particular roadmap right here, and I can reference totals in my targets that are up here. Right, I've got roughly $1 million that's in plan total costs for the entire duration of the roadmap, and I'm looking at it in 6 months perspective. The other thing I can do is before I close this down, I'm going to look at it from a sum of periods perspective. So what that means is only show me totals for the 6 months in view. I'll just go ahead and close that out. I'm looking at 6 months, but no, my totals, the in plan has really dropped down from the roughly $1 million across the duration of the roadmap to just roughly 230K-ish or so. Yeah, so I'm sitting here at roughly 235 for this 6 period duration. I'll click navigate to navigate forward, and my numbers change again, right? I'm looking at costs only for these 6 months in view, and I'll kind of scroll here. I'm just looking at, in this case, July through December of this year. I'll go ahead and set that back to grand total. I'll leave it here. And even though I'm staying in this July through December range, I brought back the totals that I'm seeing for the entire roadmap. So there's flexibility here that we'll talk about when we get into other views. There's flexibility here when we get into other views that in order, you're no longer constrained to looking at information based on roadmap start and end date. So this has got a lot more power, and you can go move around as much as you like and look at different periods. Okay, so that concludes the demo of the configurable roadmap item grid. I'm going to come back and select this view here. Pick that guy. And then we're going to move on to the demonstration of the updates to the roadmap timeline board and grid. We're just covering the grid, so we're going to focus on the board and timeline views. So while I'm here, I'm going to select I'm going to go back to, I'm at my 8 periods. I'm going to go to the timeline view. This is a quarterly view. So you can see the 8 periods on the screen here. I'm going to pick the strategy view. A little different perspective here. So, the point of coming to this page is to call out that I'm in the timeline, and you can see it's got all the powerful filtering capabilities on the top. I can select one of the roadmap items here, credit card payments, and a details flyout is present. Like I mentioned, the static pop-up that used to show up has been replaced or been eliminated and replaced with the configurable flyout. And you can see I've got my planning notes are visible here in this view. It's also got a few other elements that I had saved to the view that weren't in the view on the grid. You will notice a little nuance here. I'm going to close the panel, and the roadmap kind of scooches out a little bit more. When I do open the panel, it kind of scooches in, but my focus is on the right. I'm kind of analyzing details associated with each one with the item itself. And just like other flyouts, if I navigate to another item, the roadmap, the flyout obviously presents information for the selected roadmap item. So a lot more configurability here to include content in that flyout versus the static pop-up. All right, so the next thing I want to do is talk about the view options. Just like we showed on grid, I can look at this roadmap in terms of, so it's a 2-year roadmap, but I'm really only interested in looking at 1 year. So I'm going to come to view options, select Q4, and you'll see the page refreshes and shows me the 4 quarters, and that's all I really care about. And I could use, yeah, so that's exactly what I wanted to show, excuse me. All right, so another powerful utility to look at the roadmap without altering the roadmap. It's the roadmap start and end dates itself. This is still a 2-year roadmap. I'm just focusing in and looking at it from a 1-year perspective. Okay, so let's move to the board to demonstrate the new capabilities there. So I'm going to just go ahead and click the board view. And I'm going to select our default view. Let's get that out of the way. I've got a default view set up for myself. Okay, so you can see the same filtering capabilities that are up here, just like the rest of the roadmap area. As I select a card itself, the details flyout is available here. This is obviously new. Columns was here to kind of hide and show the defined columns. Details is obviously that new. I can get in and look at the information instead of that static pop-up that would show up in 15.9.1. So just like the timeline view, the roadmap board has been updated. The view options area is very powerful from a board perspective. So what I'm going to do is look at some card configuration here. In the prior release, the only configuration that you could do from view options was really defining the columns, you know, whether it's a pick list or not, and doing the color by. So these 2 elements at the top were what was available in 15.9.1. So now in this release, it's far more flexible. So I'm going to configure a board card here. I'm going to set some metrics. I'm going to use total cost. I'm going to use operating costs. Oops, fix that. Spell it right. Operating costs and benefit. So I've set my metrics in place. You can see the cards are already refreshing and showing that. The legend at the bottom of the screen is starting to show that. I'm going to select a strategy for the columns. Strategy, so that should repaint. I'll leave color by product, but for the roadmap fields, I'm going to uncheck roadmap item and ID and then put in here sponsor. And the other one I wanted is product. And there we go. So as you can see, the cards are refreshing. The legend is updated to show you everything that's happening with the cards. So now it's super flexible and you can save all this to a view, and it's going to behave just like the other board cards that you're familiar with, for example, in custom investments or projects or ideas that have cards for all their relative investments. So that concludes the demo of the roadmap updates, walking through how to create a roadmap with required fields, use a new configurable roadmap item grid, and then use the configurable flyout and filtering tools, as well as configuring a roadmap card.